Jenny will be in conversation with me, so I'll just introduce myself. I'm Rina Arya, and I'm at the University of Hull. I'm head of the School of Arts and professor in critical theory and cultural theory. I first came across Jenny's work several years ago when I was undertaking research on decolonising art and education. And that kick-started an ongoing correspondence looking at ways of reforming art and design education in a contemporary context. So what we're going to do today in the webinar is to explore some issues here in the conversation, after which time there'll be, some time for questions. So I'm going to ask Jenny a series of questions. We're going to have a conversation about Jenny's work. At the end of the conversation, you'll be able to see some slides with Jenny's work featured on it. And there's a discount code for her book as well, for those who would like to order it. And then we'll launch into the questions. So I firstly want to start by thanking Jenny for her really critically important work, because as I said, it provided a real steer for me into my work on decolonising. And it was also really great to reflect on the many years where I've been teaching art and design, history and theory in different universities. So if we talk a little bit about kind of decolonising first of all, and how I'd like to talk about how I came into, uh, came into Jenny's work and really what I was doing at the time. So I was looking at kind of ways in which we can think about decolonising art and design in general off the back of decolonising in the academy. So for the benefit of listeners who don't know very much about decolonising, the movement to decolonise higher education in the UK began gaining significant traction in about 2010, particularly with the rise of student activism and global political events. The Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015 challenged the legacy of colonial figures and their ties to imperial history. And this was followed in 2020 by the resurgence of the Black Lives Movement. This movement sparked broader discussions about the need to address colonial legacies in academic spaces, particularly in institutional structures and also in curricula, and that went beyond symbolic gestures, of looking at kind of doing away with statues or figures that represented colonialism, to look at how we can more deeply engage with history, knowledge, and race, and confront racial inequalities in teaching and in the culture of the academy. The push for decolonisation is seen as a project, or a process rather, that goes beyond diversifying course materials. And one of my big kind of ambitions has really been to focus on more than just the superficialities of decolonising, because I think that becomes so problematic, but to look at re-evaluating the entire educational framework by addressing inequalities and how knowledge is produced and presented. So key aspects include thinking about the inclusion of marginalised groups and voices, and critically assessing historical perspectives and creating inclusive and supportive environments. In my own research, I've been involved with the endeavour of decolonising art history and museum studies, which I think that scholarship, those areas of scholarship has been a bit more systematised than the processes of decolonising art and design education within the art school, or within departments that, have subjects like sort of fine art, visual culture. So as I was undertaking my work on decolonising, I came across Jenny's book, and just some papers that she's written. So Jenny's book is 2017, Integrating Critical and Contextual Studies in Art and Design, Possibilities for Post-Compulsory Education. And that provided a lot of, really kind of insight for me into how to how to think about decolonising um, within an art school environment or within sort of fine art or cognate subjects, especially like thinking about the way in which Jenny critically interrogates component parts that are essential to art and design education. So that is studio practice, critical and contextual studies, and then various activities that go on within these subjects like thinking, doing, writing, and making, and to look at um, how they've evolved and how they can operate in a contemporary setting. So that's what brought me to Jenny's work, and I got in touch with her. We started having really interesting dialogues. There were kind of parallel programs in a way. So my work on decolonising, Jenny's work on, these aspects of what's going on in art and design education, and then the crossover that actually, we're talking about very similar things. So this is kind of the origin of the webinar. It'll be helpful now to bring Jenny in at this moment to talk about her critically important work. So Jenny, can you give an overview of your scholarship in the areas of art and design education? And it might be quite useful to have an outline of the broad areas, themes and texts to help kick off the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Thank you. And also thank you for reaching out in the first place. It's been brilliant over the last couple of years. So yeah, my work is really about the internal workings of an art and design curriculum, of art and design subjects. And it's specifically, as Rina was saying, on that relationship between studio practice and what is termed and framed as critical and contextual studies. I'm going to refer to that as CCS throughout the webinar, but it's a term that takes on many guises, and there are lots of different terms in circulation from institution to institution. So at UE, we use at the moment the term visual culture. There are examples like contextualizing practice at other places, critical issues. The list is endless, but each of those terms do refer to something a bit different, like they're not exactly the same, all of those component parts, but they do all allude to this common curricular space. And I'm interested in both FE and HE. So just to give a bit of background, I came from teaching in FE. So before I got a full-time job at UE, which was 11 years ago now, I worked at multiple institutions, and I was and HE in FE as well. And I was often brought in as the CCS specialist. And at one point, I found myself teaching across probably about 5 institutions, and teaching into a whole load of art and design courses, plus musical theatre, performing arts, and that's on foundation degrees and BTEC courses. And that really got me thinking about my role in those practice-based courses. I felt kind of displaced. There were also some feelings of being a bit of a service provider, also on the peripheries. And I started to think about what this part of the course is. And also, I should say here as well, my background is in art history and dance. So I had some practice-based experience, which I think is how I landed the musical theatre and performing arts gig. But also I had that art history training. And then my training after that was in education. So all of this experience kind of came together for me to really lead me to question what CCS is, what its place is within courses. And my work really covers the following broad areas. So one key area is learning sites and spaces. I'm really interested in those kind of learning sites and spaces as socially constructed, and particularly the lecture theatre and the studio, and the ways that they have baggage that they carry with them, that students then acclimatise to and learn the rules and the codes of, and then kind of become socialised into those particular spaces. I'm also interested in integration. That's a really big theme in my work. So that's the integration of CCS and studio practice, and questions like what integration means, where it is located, when it happens, and I've come up with a series of models for integration that maybe we'll talk about a bit later. And I started my research thinking that integration is a good solution to some of the friction between CCS and practice and studio practice. And I thought that it was a way to help students to engage meaningfully with CCS. But through my research, I've come to see it as a lot more complicated, and maybe not, definitely not what I first assumed. So we'll talk about that a bit more. Another broad area is subject cultures. So I'm really influenced by the work of Ivor Goodson on subject cultures, and that idea that subject cultures are formed through the historical baggage that they have, what Goodson calls antecedent subject subcultures, and also contemporary practices within subjects. And these subject cultures are open to being reshaped, which I find really hopeful. That's a strand through a lot of my work. I'm also, another broad area is intuition. So I unpack the idea of intuition as rigor, intuition as a manifestation of successful integration of CCS and studio practice, knowing and not knowing, and intuition as part of the rigor of art and design. A couple of more themes just to mention. Writing practices. So these all connect. So a broad theme of writing practices comes into my work because of course, the conflation of CCS with the essay assessment, and the conflation of CCS with writing as well, on creative practice courses, as opposed to the idea of kind of writing emerging through practice. So I'm interested in ways to rethink writing practices in art schools. And then finally, assessment practices, which is part of more recent thinking, but I think is a kind of important next stage for some of that work that's come before.
Thank you. That's most comprehensive, Jenny. We'll pick up on some of these themes and issues as we're talking. So your book, the 2017 monograph you wrote, Integrating Critical and Contextual Studies in Art and Design, is like it was a culmination, wasn't it, of your research to date, where you were focusing on the historical evolution of CCS within art education and proposing innovative models for its integration. Because I think that's something that for those of us who've taught kind of CCS or worked in art schools, we're kind of aware of this sort of sometimes split between CCS and kind of studio practice. So it's really about kind of thinking about how we integrate the parts, and you've proposed innovative models for integration as well as important insights about art and design education that are highly relevant. So before we go on to talk about that, I think it's quite useful if we sort of go back in time and look at where CCS, or this need for kind of the more, in scare quotes, academic side of art and design education came in, and how that kind of led on to thinking about, say, the essay and modes of assessment like that, how that came about. So if we look at the reforms of the Coldstream report in the 1960s, I understand that one of the main reforms here was the introduction of art education as we know it now, and that is the importance of academic and theoretical studies alongside art making. So Coldstream's rationale was very much about combining critical inquiry with creative practice, and that need for art and design courses to be underpinned by this kind of strand of critical inquiry. So can you talk a little bit more about what Coldstream was trying to do? What were his intentions, and it's what happened in that in the 60s that really transformed art and design education?
Yeah, I think it's important to say from the start that it's Coldstream's legacy that has residue in art schools now, as opposed to what Coldstream actually did, Coldstream and the Summerson Committee, that is. Because there's a lot of assumptions about what the Coldstream reforms did to art schools. But my feeling, and others as well, and Julia Lockhart's done some amazing work on this, is that it's actually the power of the subject cultures themselves is much bigger than the policy. But just to give a bit of background then on Coldstream. So Coldstream really, or the Coldstream reforms really formalized CCS in the art school. So it made visible the separation between CCS and the studio, the lecture theatre and the studio. It made it look as though there was this this kind of new part of the course, this new subject CCS had just kind of landed in the course. But that's not to say that forms of CCS didn't exist pre-Coldstream. It's just that they weren't formalised as such, and they weren't assessed as such. So really, it was a point where practices of CCS became a lot more visible, but also regulated. So there was a whole load of government inspections of art schools, a whole load of them got closed down, and allegedly because of their inadequacies in delivery of this part of the course. But the aim really with the Coldstream reports was to bring this, as well as art history, bring a kind of wider complementary studies, like a general studies, into art and design courses into art schools. And the Summerson committee were quite divided on this. Like, not everybody was unanimous in wanting the same thing. So some of them wanted broader subjects like engineering and geography and politics, and others wanted this CCS to be much more kind of art history specific. So anyway, they came to this decision of combining both. There was an issue, though, at this point, that there were actually really limited staff available to deliver this CCS that the Coldstream reforms had proposed or had put forward. There were not many art historians that were trained. I mean, it was only really the Courtauld at that point that was offering an art history qualification anyway. That changed after this point, but there weren't many kind of specialist trained art historians. And not many tutors of art who felt comfortable to be delivering this new part of the course. And I'm putting new in inverted commas because I do think forms of this did exist before, they just weren't visible. So you had a lot of staff brought in from elsewhere, from other subject areas. And so what happened was those staff from other subject areas brought with them traditions like the essay assessment. And so the essay assessment it kind of was shoehorned in then at this point as a way to assess this part of the course because of the kind of people that were brought in to teach it, as opposed to it being something that Coldstream prescribed. That isn't something that was like part of the mandate for that part of the course. And the Coldstream reports have been they've kind of been criticised really for setting this critical turn or art historical turn in art education. But actually it wasn't just what was going on with the Coldstream reforms that did that. I mean, the broader art world at that time, and we should notice, the imperialist art world stage at that time, was very much about this shift towards words and concept. Conceptual art was starting to enter the canon. So practice was increasingly kind of critical and concept led beyond the art school. So that was happening out there beyond the school in that imperialist, another way we could talk about that as a colonial canon. And then within the art school itself, there were these changes. So it was happening from all angles. And at this point then, CCS became associated with writing, with the formal academic essay. It emerged, like I said, as this kind of art history, general studies. You had this words and writing culture emerging, and CCS departments were dubbed, I think at the RCA, it was dubbed the Department of Words. So you really got this kind of emphasis of the binary, this writing making binary became formalized. And this was really, although, like I said, there's some connection with what was going on in terms of conceptual art, this is really different to what was going on in schools. So this was the time when, or just before this point, this is when Marion Richardson and Herbert Reed were having all of their input into schools on child-centered models of education and of art education. But following these 60s shifts, there was also a shift in schools towards a more kind of subject-specific kind of model. So at this point, and I think what's really significant is that art history and complementary studies and the essay assessment, this particular form of writing, became this performance measure for art schools. And of course, there were these perceptions that this was threatening, that this CCS was like an alien invader coming to kind of attack practice. And there's this assumption that Coldstream is responsible for all of that and for the residue that then we have today in structures of art education. But, and Julia Lockhart was germinal in making this reading. She makes an absolutely brilliant rereading of the Coldstream reports, where she points out really clearly that there is no mention of the essay assessment in any of the Coldstream reports. There were no government recommendations for that. So they don't actually, the reports themselves don't actually uphold this myth, this writing making myth, this theory practice myth. The institutions do, the subject cultures do. It's the, you know, the tutors, the students, the institutions themselves kind of keep this going. So Lockhart shows that then that there's this kind of unfounded legacy of Coldstream, but also there are other unfounded legacies of Coldstream. So there's also this assumption that CCS should be delivered in a lecture theatre context, and that came from the Coldstream reforms. Whereas actually, I've just got a quote here I'll read. One of the Coldstream reports says specifically that the CCS equivalent, is not called CCS, they're talking about, as I said, art history and complementary studies, should not be swamped by the atmosphere of the lecture room. So it's specifically recommended that that particular learning site is not the only way that it's delivered. And also, we assume that quite often that CCS is separate to studio practice because of Coldstream, whereas actually in another one of the another quote from the report says says that it should not be prescribed whether it's studied as a separate subject or not. So it's left open. So these are choices that are put to art schools, to institutions. Yes, but I really wanted to. I think it's really important to emphasize that because it's hopeful, because it means that actually when models are not working because of for example, there being a separate subject approach, which is not leading to the best critical creative practice, there are potentials to change that.
Thank you for that overview, and it's interesting to see that what many of us have experienced in teaching or even learning is actually quite different from what Coldstream proposed, which seemed to be a bit more kind of amorphous. And certainly in my experience of teaching CCS in a number of different institutions throughout my career, in different parts of the UK, I've certainly observed, you know, the binaries that you mentioned, Jenny, and the huge variations as well in what's taught in CCS. So for ease, I've divided them into kind of 4 points because you know, I think it would be like interesting to talk about these and to see whether, you know, it's brought up in the Q&A, whether other people have kind of experienced these kind of interpretations. So the first one really is about the interpretations of the subject parameters of what counts as CCS. You know, in some cases it's the more kind of traditional Western art history, and then, you know, other interpretations are more kind of about interpretation and theory. But that huge variation raises the question of parity across institutions. So that's one of them. And then secondly, the value or purpose of CCS within curricula. A common view often being espoused is that it's not as important as studio work, and it's certainly something that kind of students don't want to undertake as readily. The third point really relates to the relationship between practice and CCS, which is, you know, often described in the binary. You talked about the you know, whether it's writing making or theory and practice or other cognate ways. I think this seems to be kind of one of the biggest stumbling blocks to have the binaries, because there's an assumption then that if you're doing, you're not thinking, or if you're writing, you're not being creative, which is something that you've really dismantled resolutely and robustly in your work. And then the fourth point, really, which we'll also talk about, is the different modes of assessment that are used in CCS. So can you start by responding to the first two of these points? So firstly, looking at the wide-ranging subject parameters, and then also the value or purpose of CCS within curricula amongst staff and students alike.
Mm. Yeah, so on the wide-ranging subject parameters, I think there are so many different practices and terms in circulation, and my feeling is that that isn't a bad thing, that the local practices is something that means that the course, and kind of nationally, it means that CCS isn't homogenized, and a focus on the local, so institutions, art schools using their own kind of local resources, expertise, experiences, rather than a kind of standardized best practice seems really fitting, and also fitting for a decolonising approach as well. But there are some commonalities, and there's definitely been a shift in influence on CCS from that art history that we talked about in connection to Coldstream to more of a kind of broad visual culture. And as part of my research, thinking again about this range of practices, as part of my research, I came up with, or these models kind of emerged through the data that I'd gathered, worked with for CCS. So the models that came through, and this is research looking at the BTEC extended diploma in art and design, which is like the equivalent to A level basically, but it's increasingly a route to HE. So I think it's significant, it's important to kind of think about where our students in university are coming from, what kind of experiences. So in that research, the three models of CCS that emerged were theory for realization, which is like a kind of immediate CCS where you know something is studied and then it's immediately put into practice. So it's almost like a spoon-fed integration. It's a way that CCS is immediately pertinent to the making. Then the second model was contextualizing the field of practice, and that tended to be more like a discrete lecture program or equivalent, some discrete delivery, but where the tutors would then help the students to make the links with their practice. So their practice was being contextualized in that way. And it may be that then that discrete delivery is actually subject specific, like specific to that program. So if it was a graphics program, it'd be a graphics kind of CCS, graphic specific CCS. And then the third model was a broader critical thinking. So these were the examples of art schools, or in this case it was an FE, where there is a broader kind of visual culture related provision which broadens the students' references beyond the subject specialisms. So they were the kind of three models that came through as dominant. And also what came through was a kind of location-based modelling. So I looked at dispersed CCS and discrete CCS. So a dispersed CCS tended to be this CCS that was occurring in the studio, in practice, at unspecified points, sometimes informally. So that also was kind of an informal CCS. And then the discrete CCS was more of a discrete separate lecture provision, which was more formalized. And while they certainly may operate simultaneously, like it would be really unusual to just have one and not the other, they both occur in most courses. There did tend to be in my research one of those models that was more dominant and that was more kind of recognised as CCS, and that led me to thinking about CCS in the lecture theatre and CCS in the studio as kind of these spaces. And then in terms of value, so in my work I used Bernstein. I've used Bernstein quite a bit to think about how subjects are valued and classified. So Bernstein talks about subject or courses where there's a really kind of tight control over the organization of knowledge, like really tight, very clear module structure, maybe very clear kind of teaching staff with each of those modules, and also he also talks about tight control over the kind of pace of knowledge transmission. So it may be, that fits really well with the idea of a lecture theatre. There's a very prescribed way of transmitting that knowledge. So he talks about those kind of course structures as being tightly classified and framed. And the opposite of that he talks about is a kind of a weak classification and framing, and that would mean a kind of blurring between the boundaries, that it might not be clear, it might be one holistic module, for example, as opposed to discrete segments of learning, that the contents of the curriculum are in an open relationship to each other, and he calls that weak classification and framing. But what is interesting, what I find useful about that is that he connects that to subject status. So what he says is then that the strong classification and framing, that kind of tight control, leads to a perception of higher status subjects. And I was thinking that makes sense in terms of that kind of structure making knowledge easier to measure, to codify, makes knowledge really visible, makes assessment very clear cut. And so it makes sense that has this kind of higher status. But in terms of CCS within an art and design course, and that idea of a kind of discrete CCS and that idea of high value being attached to it, I was thinking that also gives a kind of threat, that also carries with it some threat. So that kind of can make it threatening to the rest of the course. So there's almost too much value placed on this. And in a way, so like you were saying, Rina, about the kind of undervaluing of that subject, I wonder whether underlying that is a kind of fear of the threat of that subject taking over, as though it potentially will have too much value on the course. So I wonder whether that's rooted in a kind of anxiety, which would make sense using Bernstein's analysis if it's a discretely delivered component.
Absolutely, yeah. I can see that, and it's it's useful to have that kind of loose sense and the kind of more kind of rigid or tighter sense, and that idea of kind of the value placed on it could really sort of affect the way in which, especially within academic institutions. And I just want to pick up on something that you said as well, which I've observed myself really, is that in kind of these splits and these kind of problems really emerge in tertiary education, don't they? But they're not as, in kind of further education. And sort of prior to that as well, or the kind of there tends to be sort of greater integration, doesn't there? So yeah, thank you for that. So in your monograph, you talk about the discrete delivery of CCS as a support to rather than a deterrent to integration. So, can we look a little bit more at this idea of integrating the parts? How does it happen? And I think you said earlier on about you being interested in where, when, and how. So, can you talk a little bit about these two coming together and kind of what happens really?
Yeah, yeah. So the trajectory is that during that research project, I saw a number of models of integration, which I called, there was one that I called designed integration, where it's kind of designed into the curriculum, prompted integration, where tutors would kind of help to make the connections, collaboration as integration, which was a great one, natural integration, where it's kind of left to happen, to occur, as it were, naturally, and disintegration, where you get this kind of you remove the boundaries to such an extent that you get a kind of dissolve of any idea of kind of subject specificity, and you get this disintegration of what you might understand as CCS. So I started with this kind of range of models that emerged through the data, and then also I looked to Pring. So Richard Pring talks about integration as an approval word, and I found what he says really really key, really at the crux of it all, is that there's this assumption that integration is something positive and desirable as a kind of it's an educational aim. But although it's something which is kind of perceived as aspirational and desirable to help student engagement and experience and understanding, there isn't much which really unpacks integration and what it actually means, and also some of the potential problems with it as well. So there's this kind of promise of integration, but without really an unpacking of it. So this is kind of part of my way into looking at what integration really is. So as you say, my questions were about where it's located and what point it happens. And I came up with, so I'm just throwing models out there, but these next three models I'll just talk about in a bit more detail, and you can read a bit more about these in the book with the discount code that we'll show you at the end. But the three models that I came up with ultimately, that to me felt like they could be really good starting points, irrespective of whether you're working in FE or HE, for approaching CCS in art and design. And the three models that I came up with really are about looking at whether integration is immediate or a longer term goal, or whether it's and whether it's in the individual student or written into the curriculum. So it felt like these were kind of really key things to decide between. It sounds again like I'm putting in a whole load of binaries. I don't mean to do that, but they're just kind of models, like ways of looking at it. So those three models that I came up with were called designed integration, facilitated integration, and intuitive integration. I just want to say a couple of things about each one. So designed integration is when you have this integration written into the curriculum. So CCS and practice are put together in the curriculum itself, and they come together in the student's current practice. So it looks student-centered, but in the research that I did, and there was one particular case study which was a really good example of this, the students were relatively passive. So they were kind of provided with this ready-made curriculum. It was already integrated without them having to do any of the synthesizing themselves. And in this particular case study that I look at in the book, the boundaries between the modules within the course were really blurred and dissolved, but the boundaries around the course itself were really tight. So the course was quite insular within the institution, within the college. And so there were issues with that in terms of kind of looking outwards and moving out of subject silos. So it kind of did that designed integration that looks on the surface like it's something quite progressive. Actually, my findings were that it was the opposite of that. And then facilitated integration is a second model. So in this model, this happens rather than in the curriculum, this actually happens within the student, but it still happens immediately. So there's still the immediacy that you get with designed integration, but with facilitated integration, it happens with the student. And so what happens there is that the staff will kind of prompt the students through the connections between CCS and their practice. So there'll be some kind of hand holding on that in a sense. So the students aren't completely autonomous to make those connections, but they are given some separate provision, but then they are helped to make the links between them, and they're encouraged to make those links between them as well, which I think is an important part of that model. The third model, which is the one that for me resonates the most and that I feel I can argue for as well most confidently, is intuitive integration. So this third model is about integration being a process, being a kind of a project, something which isn't immediate and can't even be put into particular points through the course, which doesn't sound very useful as an educational approach, but just bear with me. So it's about the element that CCS and studio practice coming together at unprescribed points. It could be beyond the course, it could be within the course, but it's not kind of dictated. It's about a future kind of realization, and that integration happens within the student. So the student does that work, the student does that synthesizing. But what I propose is that although it sounds unuseful in terms of assessment and in terms of kind of the measures, a module has to have a start and end point, and we want the students to get to a certain point by the end of that module. We have learning outcomes that we want to kind of work with the students. So this model sounds like there isn't like an institutional ideology really for this model, but I think that curricula can be designed to accommodate it. And I also think, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about later, but I also think that actually a shift in assessment and how we understand assessment could help to really facilitate that model. So if we move our thinking away from assessment as, and I'm saying lots of places already do this, but if the thinking about assessment is moved away from the idea of assessment as a kind of measure of learning, an assessment of the learning that's happened, but instead as a part of the learning, a part of the process, then it fits, I think, with this idea of intuitive integration. And so my thinking there is then that students integrate intuitively, seemingly unthinkingly and unknowingly, which is kind of some of the connotations of intuition. But I argue that actually to do something intuitively is to have a lot of experience and skill in order to be able to make those connections and do something which appears intuitive. That happens over time and with increased experience and skill. Yes, so and I think intuition is really important because I think it can be argued to be part of the rigor of art and design. I think intuition can be taken as this idea that it's about a sophisticated manifestation of thinking, doing, making, writing, knowledges in all of their multiple forms coming together and then manifesting in the students making this work apparently unthinkingly, as though it's a kind of hunch. And there's obviously lots of problematic romantic myths about the idea of a kind of untutored, genius that you just kind of get gifted and it happens. But actually, what I'm arguing is that all of that happens. It looks like that on the surface, but there's a lot of work and connection that goes on behind that. And that's really at the heart of the intuitive integration model, that we as educators then can set up the conditions for students to be able to work intuitively, and for these things to come together at an unprescribed point. So it gives a lot more autonomy. It's not determined, but my thinking is that that kind of creates more self-determined students. I feel like I've got quite a lot more to say on this, but I feel like I'm talking quite a long time without it.
Let's pick up on with intuition, because it makes a lot of sense, because again, some of my observations about the way these two aspects come together is that it is something that takes time and experience, as intuition is the case, but there's also non-linearity, isn't there, in that you can't teach it, it just sort of happens, and it's subjective. So for some students, it kind of happens much sooner than other at different points. But intuition does allow for kind of the realization of sort of the commonalities between, the underlying skills, if you like, and maybe that's why, Jenny, it has been so difficult to really standardize CCCS, and also think about how just the pragmatics of teaching it, because when it comes down to it, when we're thinking about art and design education, I think a lot of us would agree, won't we, that can you teach creativity? I mean, you can teach critical thinking, can't you? But then there's other aspects of that when we're trying to think about it in relation to creativity. And intuition is a fundamental part of creativity. So, it can't be quantified in the ways that, other subjects can be, and hence, I mean, you said, didn't you, that you thought that this model of that you were proposing, of intuition is the one that you're able to kind of propound the most confidently. Is that because you feel that that's core to kind of the activities that are involved?
Yeah, and I feel like because, like you were saying, because the term intuition has been such a bit like the term theory. It's one of those kind of mystified terms, these kind of and these terms that carry with them quite a lot of assumptions. So I'm just thinking, an example has just sprung to mind that I just would like to mention because it does feel relevant. Is that in my argument then, intuition is kind of the manifestation of this sophisticated kind of synthesizing of skills, experiences, knowledges. And I was teaching an MA class the other day, and a student talked about what about this kind of childlike intuition, this idea, that is unthought, that's kind of, that's how she was understanding intuition, as something which it was basically like a counter argument to the one that I was making. But I suggested that actually that what we're calling intuition, this kind of intuition that you see in childlike behavior, is actually the same thing. There is still this manifestation of experience and skill. It's just that some of that might be non-verbal, embodied. And actually what that points to is the importance of those kind of non-verbal knowledges, which obviously is key for creative practice students. And so with this model of intuitive integration that I really kind of advocate for, that came out of the research, what I'm really saying is that knowledges can take on multiple guises, which we all know in art schools, but that just isn't always the way that they are. They're not always valued beyond the art school in that way, or they're not always kind of seen as valuable in the way that they're understood within art schools. My proposal is that taking that idea of embodied knowledge, tacit knowledge, but also some codified knowledges as well, like a whole range of knowledges, and thinking about the student as the kind of common denominator who works with all of these knowledges. That could be across different modules, different parts of their course, different teaching staff that they come into contact with. If we can help the students to synthesize those, if we can kind of use those as almost like building blocks that the students then start to work on together to then create what looks like this kind of hunch, or whatever we might put it, intuition, for me, I think what we could do is argue for that as part of the rigor of art and design. So think about intuition itself as part of the rigor of art and design, rather than something which, and this has happened in the past, has been used to kind of frame or sort of shroud art and design as mysterious and impenetrable and untutored and impossible to understand. So it's really about a kind of shifting of the way that the intuition is thought about. And it's not, this isn't, I hope I'm not making it sound, probably, but I don't mean to make it sound as though this is just me. Like, other people have thought in these ways, like Fortnum and Fisher talk about the artist's hunch and this idea of not knowing, and how, like, the hunch is the rationale, and that there's a lot of kind of work that goes on behind that to get that hunch. Susan Melrose talks about an expert intuitive leap. So, she's talking about this idea that, especially with tacit knowledges and embodied knowledges, there's something that happens where you kind of make a leap to cover a gap in reasoning, as she articulates it. But for me, what she's saying there is the same kind of idea that I'm talking about with intuition. And I feel like that's really important, that we could even bring that into our curricula as well and talk to students about that process. So it's not just about, in CCS, talking to them about the content, but talking about that process of how these different elements of their experience might come together and lead to what looks like intuitive kind of outcomes.
Yeah, that's very compelling, definitely, and a way forward to look at, where we are kind of with contemporary in the contemporary climate. Can you talk a little bit about the actual? So you've talked a bit about kind of the theories and models that you've looked at. What about the fieldwork that you did in your book, especially in relation to the surveys of what's going on at kind of various art schools? Can you talk about the fieldwork research you did for your
Yeah,
book?
so in the fieldwork, I sent surveys out to so this is the extended diploma in art and design course in the UK, and I got like 70 responses back, so that was brilliant. So I had quite a large sample, and the survey initially was really looking at how integration was understood by CCS staff and studio staff. So I sent a questionnaire to CCS member of staff and a studio member of staff separately, if they were separate, and in most cases they were. And then I wanted to get a sense of what integration actually meant to these staff members. And then alongside that, I asked for the name given to the CCS element of the course, detail on when it was taught, its credit weighting. So all those kind of logistical, sort of pragmatic features of what helps to form the identity of this part of the course. And I asked about teaching staff as well, teaching teams. So I was really trying to get a sense of the position of this part of the course, how it was assessed. That was another question. I asked the assessment methods, or the assessments that the students were asked to do. And it really helped me to see that actually the term integration is understood so differently across all of those courses. And that's really how I got to the point. Like I've mentioned Penton, which is one of the case studies. Obviously, that's a pseudonym. With the designed integration example, I chose Penton as a case study because from the survey, it sounded as though this was a kind of fully integrated course. And I thought this sounds really progressive and really interesting. And that's when I sort of dug deeper and interviewed teaching staff, but also management as well, and looked at really how, in that case, it was actually more of a kind of controlling nurturance, to use the language of transactional analysis, that was going on. That I talked before, didn't I, about the insularity of the course. So even though you had this kind of integration within the course, there you had really tight boundaries around the course. So the survey then was really to get a sense of those different models, and then the case studies. That was the next stage. I conducted 5 case studies. That was really to unpack some of those meanings and to challenge what looked on the surface to be an integrative approach. And it was surprising, because from that research, I found that the course that looked on the surface to be less progressive, more kind of outmoded in terms of those kind of 20th century ideals of, a sort of discrete CCS studio provision. A course that seemed more outmoded in those terms and that delivered separately had really good examples of what I would now call an intuitive integration being set up. That actually the students were has agency in making those links between aspects of their course. And so I read that then as more meaningful integrative practice, despite on appearances it looking like an outmoded separate subject approach.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to look at spaces of learning, which is something you've talked about in the book, especially across, kind of thinking about discrete spaces that of the lecture theatre and the studio. I'm interested in what you had to say about the writing and making divide in one of your recent papers, I Came Here to Do Art, Not English, which was published in the Journal of Writing and Creative Practice. So, can you talk, Jenny, about the divide or split between these different activities in different spaces, focusing on what the studio means and the lecture theatre as well, or equivalent?
So that article was like a kind of historical mapping of staff and student socialization, the way that staff and students have been socialized into a writing making binary through, as you said, some of those learning spaces. And what I really pointed to in that article was the way that the writing making binary, part of the broader theory practice myth, clashes with a lot of art and design courses, but also persists in a lot of art and design courses. So it kind of clashes with the subject culture, the kind of understanding and the staff understanding of how the course is or should be, but still had residue. And so subject cultures is really, I mean, to talk about the spaces, I think subject cultures is really important to just come back to in a bit more detail. So the learning sites, the lecture theatre being associated with this sort of visible, messy, dialogic, rhizomatic, kind of tacit, embodied knowing. This idea that in the studio, knowledge isn't always visible. Of course it is, but it isn't in a codifiable, measurable way in which knowledge has kind of come to be understood. And then the lecture theatre, on the other hand, kind of connotes, and these are stereotypes, but what I say is that the spaces kind of carry this weight with them. The lecture theatre connotes the kind of words, text, oration, a kind of transmission model of learning, a pedagogical authority of the lecture theatre, which Bourdieu and Passeron talk about. So this idea that, the lecturer's podium or chair kind of emanates this authority, no matter who occupies it. So this idea of spaces as socializing, having the potential to socialize and to make learning cultures, I found really useful to think about then the writing and making. So the idea that writing is kind of conflated with the lecture theatre, with the essay assessment, making is conflated with the studio. And also just to add in on the studio as well, that idea of the kind of dialogic, like kind of exchange learning. A kind of exchange is a signature pedagogy that Shreve, Sims and Trowler talk about, which is really interesting. Yeah, I don't think we've got time to talk about it in detail, but that's really interesting as in juxtaposition with that idea of a transmission model of learning and knowledge exchange. So these two spaces then create two really discrete identities on a course, and students are kind of dual citizens in that sense. Like they're socialized into those spaces quite differently. And it becomes a way, the lecture theatre and the studio became, in the research, these really useful ideal types to refer to. I've already mentioned the discrete and the dispersed CCS, which is kind of how they emerged as well in thinking. But there's also obviously potential to reconfigure them. I was thinking about, the coronavirus pandemic, like post-pandemic models of online learning. Does the online environment democratize spaces? Does the online space shift some of those old kind of identities of the lecture theatre and the studio by creating this more neutral space? But I'm not sure, because I think the historical legacy of the lecture theatre and the studio is really powerful. And to give a bit more, to kind of substantiate that a bit, I mentioned Goodson. So Ivor Goodson talks about antecedent subject subcultures, and what he means by that is the identities that the subjects bring with them. So he says they're constructed, they're formed. So in the case of CCS, CCS's antecedent subject subculture would be coming from this Coldstream legacy, this idea of a kind of lecture theatre, dominant voice, transmission model of learning, essay assessment, codified knowledge, visibility. So that is part of the antecedent subject subculture, Goodson would say. And the studio maybe has a different kind of antecedent subject subculture. So you've got this issue within art and design that you've got two antecedent subject subcultures cohabiting, irrespective of how the course is structured. They come with that historical baggage, but that's not to say that they're unmovable, unshiftable, inflexible, because Goodson also says that then you have contemporary subject cultures which come in and sometimes clash with those antecedent subject subcultures, but also can work to kind of reshape them. And Goodson says that staff and teaching staff and institutions are key in that socialization, in making those cultures. I think I've added to that by suggesting that students are also really key in that. So my position is that it's not just the more kind of powerful players within those systems who have the potential to shape those cultures, but actually the students also are part of that reshaping. So, you know, I find subject culture is a really hopeful way to think about spaces and the writing making divide and the way that all of this can be unseated, because, you know, there's potential for a subject culture rewrite by, you know, students and stuff. That could be a project, you know, that could be kind of an assessment, a way to kind of think about assessment, think about writing assessments, getting students and staff to work together to make a subject culture rewrite for their institution feels like a really exciting way to put new ideas out there and to make shifts in some of those traditional structures.
And we've seen, haven't we, Jenny, like during the pandemic, about even the transformation in the way in which the studio is conceived, because even though, you know, arguably it's, you know, remains a cornerstone of art education, and yet with in the pandemic, with people, students having to sort of work from home and not being able to use the studio in the same way, I think that and also with the impact of digital technology, there's been transformations in how we conceive of not just the studio space, but also the lecture theatre as well. I think we've seen kind of changes that have, you know, stayed really. Okay, I think we should talk a little bit about assessments as well, which is an ongoing theme in your work, especially the essay. So in earlier, when I talked about the reflections on the divisions that I've encountered throughout my career, it occurred to me that while students often did enjoy kind of complementary studies or CCS or the art historical aspects of their courses, the point of dissension was the assessment, and that took away the joy or what they perceived as a relevance of it. So many students often, in my experience anyway, didn't want to write essays and didn't see the relevance of them. But that's not to say that they didn't like writing, because they did. But it was writing in, you know, whether in their sketchbooks or taking a kind of different form from the essay. So the assessment of a formal essay seemed to be a real problem. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about the essay as assessment and what we can do in place of it if, you know, these problems aren't something that we can easily solve?
Yeah, I think the problem comes when writing is conflated with the formal essay, and when writing is used as an assessable measure as opposed to part of the process of learning and as a practice. So I think I don't think there's a problem with the essay per se in itself, but there is when it's presented as the kind of the only form of critical writing that counts. So I wonder whether there are other kinds of critical writing that we could think about. And it's probably worth mentioning here that within the, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about this at the end, but within the Visual and Material Practices Research Group at UE, we have a strand of research activity called Writing Practices. And within that, we have a couple of networks. One is called WITA, one is called WOW. So WOW, Ways of Writing in Art and Design, is really interested in alternatives to the academic essay, and it's a group of visual culture specialists from UWE who are part of that, but also Julia Lockhart, whose work is really important in this field, and Jo Lee, who's at Sheffield. And so as part of the work with that group, we've looked at, would it mean for a piece of poetry or prose or a recipe to be an example of critical writing? Like, how could we work with that and frame that kind of writing in that way? And we've been really interested in the way that Julia Lockhart talks a lot about this, the way that within art schools, the forms of writing that are most commonly assessed haven't emerged from creative practice. They've been brought in, and we mentioned at the beginning Coldstream and those staff members beyond art and design who were brought in to teach some of that 15% CCS element and brought with them the essay assessment. So there are a whole load of writing practices that emerge through art and design, that emerge through creative practice, that are really interesting and are valid as critical examples of critical writing. And Julia, I've mentioned Julia a few times, but she set up Writing Pad in 2002, which was on a real mission to look at writing purposefully in art and design and looking at alternative writing forms, alternatives to the academic essay. And Writing Pad then kind of merged into the journal that she made. So she edits a journal called the Journal for Writing and Creative Practice, which really showcases writing from creative practice. And we, as the UWE visual culture team, have guest edited some of those journal series. But so what I think is important then is to shift the view of writing, which I think everybody in art schools probably unanimously agrees with, but it's just that a lot of courses have got stuck on the essay as the only option. But shift this view to writing as a material practice, a material practice that also has transdisciplinary potential, that it has potential to kind of move between subjects, to bring students together from across different disciplines. And when viewed in that way, it is a boundary crossing practice medium. Maybe it still can be a tool. So I don't think being a tool has to be a bad thing. And I think it's when it's a kind of assessment measure only, that's when it's problematic. But all of this, and especially these ideas of boundary crossing, seems to resonate as well with the decolonising approach. So it feels like maybe writing has some potential to do something quite radical within art schools. And I think it's important not to just remove like writing, just to kind of absolve ourselves from writing. Like, writing is emergent in creative practice, and I think it's really important for the students to experience that. And to shift away from seeing academic writing as the only form of assessment, which obviously in a lot of institutions it's not. And there are a lot of places where there are alternatives, maybe like a visual essay or a presentation or other kind of modes of writing. But I wonder whether more of a emphasis on writing practices and on students kind of deciding, having more autonomy in where they take it. So rather than kind of being prescribed options, whether there's potential in assessment for students to design their own assessments. Maybe writing practices is the broad theme, and essay might be one of the options that they choose, but where they have the opportunity to create their own assessment briefs, basically their own kind of assessment methods, and then maybe reflect on that as part of their course, as part of their learning. So I think there is potential to not just give alternatives to the essay, but to really stick with and rethink writing. And also I'm just thinking as well as I'm saying this about Jo Lee, who we work with, Jo Lee, who is at Sheffield and is part of the Visual and Material Practices Research Group and part of WOW. Jo Lee talks about the essay as essay in terms of the French word essayer, to try, and she's talked about the essay as experimental, and maybe there are ways to also rethink the essay itself. So I don't think it's necessarily about throwing the essay out, but thinking about the essay alongside multiple other options and also rethinking the form of the essay itself.
Yeah, so as you said, like the essay as a tool, but not necessarily as a kind of summative assessment, which would be really helpful in the contemporary climate when we're thinking about, meeting the needs of more diverse students, like international students whose first language might not be English, or neurodivergent students. And sort of reconceiving how we think about the essay. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so just a couple of quick questions, really. We've covered a lot of ground, Jenny, and it's clear that, your work has involved decolonising thinking and about rethinking and transforming practices, educations, and spaces as well. And the way in which you've looked at the biases of like knowledge and practices and modes of learning as well. I want to ask you about where you'd like to see art and design education in the future. Where do you think what can we be looking at?
I think partly connected to what we were just talking about the restraints of assessment. I feel like that's an area that feels really important to play with more radically, which lots of institutions are doing that. But I think I'm really inspired by Schick and Timperley's work on assessment as pedagogy. And they talk about this idea then as assessment as not a measure of learning, but something which is part of the process of learning. And they're in their argument about assessment as pedagogy, they're actually working the article that they published, which came out this year, was not really about art and design students specifically. It's about creative assessment methods, but it's about politics students and students from other subjects. And what they're trying to do is really encourage the students to work collaboratively and to take on assessment methods that are not familiar to them. So that might be creative in their case. And I'm inspired by that and thinking about our students and thinking that if our students were enabled to design their own assessment methods, encouraged to work relationally, collaboratively, maybe even with students from other courses. What would it be to have a graphic design student and a history student coming together and making some work? It could even be that it's a discussion about something, or that there's a kind of particular object that they create, or something which is kind of relational, feels really important, and also feels like it connects to the idea of intuitive integration, that idea of kind of connections between. So I think moving away from isolated assessment, individualism, more about kind of connection and collaboration, reaching between. And that's where I keep coming back to writing as this idea of this transdisciplinary medium that has this transdisciplinary practice as well, that has this potential to join between subjects. I think could be really exciting. And it's probably worth noting as well, when thinking about where art schools are going, what's been happening at FE, because we are so connected, because so many of our students will come, or so many of the students that come to HE will have come through FE routes. So in FE, there's been a real shift over the last 15 years from, like, the CCS element has changed title. So it was, I've got it written down here so I can get it right. So it's historical and contextual influences in art and design before 2010. Then it was contextual influences in art and design. Then it was critical and contextual studies in art and design. Then there was some personal investigation projects. So you see there's this trajectory from a kind of more historically grounded study to complement practice, to something which is more critical and connected, but not necessarily connected, like I was saying, in a designed way where it's kind of written into the curriculum. But connected can be that, for example, you've got I don't know, a CCS tutor comes along to studio crits, and the CCS tutor and the studio tutor are talking together about and with the student about their work, or with their work. So you've got the kind of the work, the student, the CCS tutor, the practice tutor, kind of all in dialogue together, and obviously the peers, the rest of the group. So I feel like we can write in these moments into the curriculum without that being the only part of, alongside something which is more of a kind of building blocks and something which is more discrete. And I think as well, thinking about the future of art schools, I just think that emphasis, which we did mention briefly earlier, on the local is really important. And so thinking about ways that can be supported and nurtured in individual institutions, that idea of local knowledge, local ideas, local practices can be, that, although that might sound in some ways to be something which could be reductive or it's kind of siloed, I think it can be the opposite of that, and it can really kind of celebrate then differences between institutions. So I think shifting away from an idea of the standardized, which most of us probably try and do anyway, and I'm just mention one other thing that I'm really inspired by. It's quite old now, but Bergen Sieber's The Slow Professor from 2016 is just such a brilliant, for me, it's been such a kind of informative text to help me to think through my ideas about immediacy and the standardized, and how we can make shifts in this neoliberal university context into something radical, which is more fitting with art and design students.
And much of your research, as well as not just kind of the written work that you've done, but is included in some of the networks that you're a part of and the groups as well, the research groups. So can you talk a bit about kind of the research groups at UE and any other groups that you feel are kind of relevant here?
Oh yeah, Leah, could you put on the slide, please, for the VAMP,
Yeah, will do.
not the VAMP, the Visual Material Practice Research Group, VAMP. So I'll just start talking about it while Leah finds the slide. So yeah, so there's a newly formed research group at UE that Claire Johnson, who's in the room, and I co-lead. It's called the Visual and Material Practices Research Group. And really that group is about it. Our members are a combination of writers, makers, practitioners of all sorts, really, and all interested in visuality and materiality. And what we do, at risk of reinforcing a false binary, is put writers and makers into conversation in order to generate new knowledge. So we unpack the ideas about knowledge hierarchies. That's really important in our work. We have 4 strands of research activity. So disrupting visual histories, cultures of care, writing practices, which I've mentioned, art school futures, and materiality and place. So those, I'll just, oh, thank you, Leah. So those 5, have I mentioned all of those? Yeah. So those 5 strands of research activity really emerge from our membership. So we review these all the time. They're not kind of predetermined. They come through the research that is happening with our members. And our members are from UE, but also beyond UE as well. I just should say that the website is about to be, we've changed the logo and the title of the group. So the address you can see there, www.vamp-rg.org, doesn't actually work quite yet, but I wanted to put that version up there so that if you want to just make a note of it, it should be live soon. So our web designer is just making a couple of tweaks. But yeah, so if you look us up and you can't find us, just yeah, sit tight, it will be there soon. And we're having a launch, we're launching on the 9th of December, we're having a launch event at Watershed. And yes, maybe drop me a line separately if you're interested in our work, but you can find a lot of information about what we do on the website.
Thank you. So should we go to Leah? Can we go to the slide with Jenny's publications on? I think that would be helpful. I think there's a contact email address for you there as well, or maybe you could put it in the chat. I think if and the next slide is about the book, isn't it, with the discount code, just in case anyone on the webinar would like to purchase it. Is it the next one, isn't it?
Yeah,
Here we are.
20%
Brilliant.
code.
So we've got just under 10 minutes for questions. So we could, if you've got a question, if you want to put it in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up, I don't know what would work better. Try both, and then we can take it from there. Okay, there's Neil Walton. Should we start with you, Neil? If you unmute yourself. And
Leah might need to do. Leah, do you need to unmute Neil? Sorry, Neil, we've taken controlling you.
Yeah, I'll just unmute now. I think, Neil, you should be able to speak now.
if you're not able, maybe if you put it in the chat, Neil, and then one of us can, read it out.
Sorry about that, Neil.
Okay, you put it in the Q&A.
Oh, hello.
Oh, hiya.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, hello. Okay, thank you. So thank you so much, Jenny and Rina. It's really interesting. So my question is just this. I'm curious to know how commonly the term art history is used in art schools and how often those who teach in art schools have trained as art historians.
Thanks, Neil. As far as I understand it, as far as I know from the work that I've done, art history is less and less common. So even back when I was doing the work in FE, art history was more common there than it was in the university, in the art school, with the HE art school. And I think that may be partly because of some of the FE management systems or tutors assuming that this is what the university wants. So this is the way we ought to prepare our students for university. But the reality was that it was becoming less and less common in the art school anyway. In terms of training and tutors, CCS tutors in art schools with an art history training, I think from my experience, that's still common, but the actual so and if you just think about my own case, like I have the art history background, but it doesn't really kind of come in as a key part of my identity and my role in my teaching as a CCS tutor, and in my management of CCS modules. So it feels that there is still some of that trend of art historians moving over to the art school, but also I think there's a bit of the other way around as well, that art history courses are becoming a bit more open to practice. Like we had an event recently at Bristol University, and it was really interesting talking to the staff there about how they've shifted some of their modules to include practice, and their perception that it was important for their students to also have experience of practice. So I feel like there is a good bit of cross-pollination between those disciplines, and I think there are still art historians in the art school. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So we've got a question from Matthew Bowman, which is about cohort sizes. So Jenny, I was wondering if you can respond to this. So I'll read it out. I was wondering to what extent cohort sizes are reflected in the models that you've spoken about. For example, where Matthew is, our cohorts are fairly small, say about 15 students a year, and we have a small course team. At present, the modules of studio practice and CCS are discrete as distinct modules being taught in distinct spaces. But we find that over the course of teaching from level 4 to 6, the integration largely happens, that students become mostly very confident in writing and that there's a crossover. But this might be due to the small sizes, which allows a closer interpersonal link with students to happen. So can you comment on cohort sizes, Jenny, and the relevance they might hold?
Yeah, I think cohort sizes to one side for a second, but what you've just described about that trajectory is really fitting with that intuitive integration model, that idea of the kind of the process, the kind of moving through those years and over time. And in terms of the cohort sizes, they were in the research in the book, they were mainly kind of about 30, that sort of size. Yeah, variable, but around sort of 30, 40.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Moving on to another question by Judith Winter at Glasgow School of Art. So rather than a comment, you focus very much on the touchstone of the Coldstream Summerson report, and your observations resonate that the ideas and recommendations have been lost and misinterpreted over time. I was wondering if you could say something about the policy that's occurred post-industrialisation. So what occurs to art schools post-1996? And how the homogenizing of systems of knowledge have been radically altered through the academic standards that have merged with the universities. Can you say something about that, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think one reaction to that is I go back to the slow professor, that idea of slowness, and that idea of kind of moving away from, because I think part of that shift also comes with it some of that immediacy and direct outcomes and the kind of codified knowledge, which becomes quite generic as well. So I think, I suppose a response to that is to go back to that idea of slowness that Berg and Sieber talk about, and process and slow it down as opposed to a kind of immediate outcomes. But also I suppose art and design obviously didn't grow out of the university, which on the one hand causes some issues, and you know, we might think about those in relation to the essay assessment and those kind of codified knowledges and some of those shifts and those kind of post-92 universities. But on the other hand, it's maybe part of its freedom, its kind of potential to do something different. Like, it doesn't, if we were thinking about the antecedent subcultures that we talked about in the webinar, art and design doesn't have that kind of attachment to the university in the same way as some other subjects have. So although it doesn't kind of seem to make much difference in terms of pragmatics, it's maybe something to kind of keep in mind, that there is that freedom from those constraints, like maybe thinking through other ways that art and design can shape itself, with obviously within the system of the university, but without having that baggage of the kind of university traditions.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Judith, who says that she'd like to be in touch about art school futures. So I'll leave that for both of you to be in touch. Are there any other questions? I think we've got time for one more question. James Baggett Brown, if you want to either put it in the chat or Leah can unmute you. Well, I think it's in the chat, isn't it? Thank you, Celia. Sorry, Colin. James, do you want to put the question? Yes. So feel free to either ask the question or add it to the chat, and I'll read it out.
You should be able to unmute yourself, James, if you want to.
Hello.
Hi, yeah, we can hear you.
Great, brilliant, thank you. Sorry, I was typing furiously, and I'm not a very fast typer.
I know, it was reminding me of when we teach online and you ask the students a question, it's like dead, but they're all trying talking about invisible, like visibility and invisible. Yeah, sorry.
It was only briefly kind of making a connection between Jenny, what you're saying about intuition, and also about I guess the way we've been thinking about sort of freeing students from the essay as the kind of sole and only way of working. And I think Jenny spoke to you at Bristol at the AAH conference briefly about kind of what we've been doing at Bath Spa, our level 6, our third year module, where we have put the emphasis on the students to find them, like you were saying, to find that mode of writing that best suits them individually as artists. And we're kind of framing the students' writing now is writing as artists and finding their way. And all I want to say really is that what we found, that we're now into currently the second year of these new modules, which have moved away from dethroned the essay, as we've been calling it. And what we found already is that, as expected, students are evidently more than capable of defining their own relationship with writing, without necessarily needing the kind of structure of the essay. And in student feedback just from last year, we've started to see words like enjoying coming into student feedback in relation to writing, which we haven't seen very often before. So I just wanted to kind of give that kind of slight note of hope in terms of what you were saying about, the possibility of actually giving ownership to the students in terms of how they negotiate their relationship with writing. And so far in 1 year, that there seems to be a shift and quite a significant shift in the attitude of students towards of art students towards writing, and less of I didn't come here to do English, you know. So yeah, that was it really.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate that comment. That's just really, it's such a hopeful, optimistic comment, and also a really nice way to end as well. And it's, as you're saying that, it's reminding me as well of the where we saw you at Bristol. It was our session was called Writing Joyously, and that idea of enjoyment that you mentioned and joy and bringing that into writing practices is so important. But I love the way that you've just outlined that, saying that you don't even as tutors have to kind of force that in, because it emerges through the students finding their way to connect with writing. Thank you for that comment.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, James. We've got one more, so could we let's take one more, and if others need to leave, because I know we've overrun, that's fine, but let's have this one. So that's from Ria. What are your thoughts on writing the self or reflective approaches in design practice?
Thanks,
Writing
Ria.
the self. Yeah.
Could you say, would you be able to say a bit more about that? About what you mean by that? Leah, maybe you could unmute Ria if Ria doesn't mind.
Ria's, you should be unmuted as well now.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Ria.
so
Yes, we
sorry
can.
about that.
Oh, not at all. No, don't worry.
I'm still trying to figure out where things are on Teams. Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
No.
Basically, I'm asking because I'm writing from more, and I've also published with the Journal of Writing Practice with Intellect. And I'm really interested in seeing how our design students are able to write from a more reflective position or writing themselves into their work. Because in my own writing, I'm coming from a sort of sensory autoethnography style of writing, and it has worked for me, and I've been able to find ways of saying things that I never thought I'd be able to say. And what I'm looking at versus the students that we're getting now that are sort of still finding themselves in level 4 and still trying to understand where they fit. I'm just wondering wondering what your thoughts are based on the research that you've done. How are students sort of approaching that sort of, or navigating this sort of reflective writing or writing themselves into their work? Because I find that some students are having a problem with it, but then other students sort of gravitate towards it because it's sort of leaving behind this sort of academic structure, but at the same time we're supporting them in trying to find something that's comfortable for them that is still on the academic side. I don't know if I made sense.
No, that does make sense. Thank you, Ria, for that question. Yeah, I think that especially at level 4, where you were saying like some of the students struggle with writing themselves into their work and others maybe don't. But I think at level 4, where they're coming from maybe a background like the one that I talk about in my book with the FE model, but also from schools increasingly as well, or foundation courses, they are sometimes still at that level of maybe associating writing with something detached. Like that idea of kind of the self in writing is so key in art schools, but also beyond as well. But I think sometimes there's a bit of an assumption with level 4 students that there's a prescribed way they ought to write. So I think that kind of opening up writing possibilities for students, and also getting them kind of writing from the outset without associating writing with the product or a finished piece, but the idea of like writing as a process and ideas coming through writing, and maybe kind of collaborative writing and writing that isn't going to kind of be put through into getting a grade for something, but just practicing that idea of writing as a practice could be like a nice way for particularly students who have come from quite prescribed school backgrounds to just be freed up a bit about how they see writing in the context of creative practice. And I just say as well, in terms of level 4, our excellent colleague Rebecca Bell is for her, she runs the level 4 module at UE, and she's introducing from next year a zine as their assessment. So that idea of kind of writing practices combined with visual and making practices. And just so thinking about different ways that writing can be formed. And I think just final point that I think making writing inclusive and broad and process based and creative is part of our ethic of care as artist educators, art school tutors, for students, because it's a way to think about embracing all students and neurodivergent students and students who have other needs, which mean that the traditional academic essay isn't an authentic learning process for some of those students. So I think opening writing is a more kind of inclusive, democratizing way forward. So I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but thank you for your question, Ria.
Thank you,
Thanks
Ria.
so much. Thank you.
And thank you, Jenny. Thank you everyone for attending today, and I think we probably need to wrap it up now. So I don't know whether this is going to be this presentation is going to be sent to kind of people on the webinar, but if it's not, Jenny, maybe you could put your email address in the chat if anyone wants to buy your book and has kind of problems ordering it, or if they've any kind of other questions. But I want to thank you, Jenny, for such a stimulating discussion, and we're going to have many more. So watch this space. I'm sure there'll be kind of other, webinars and events. And also thank you very much to Leah for helping us with the support for putting this together. And it's very much appreciated. So, and thank you to everyone for attending as well. It's been a really stimulating discussion, and the questions have been fantastic as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and also thank you, Rina, for sowing this seed and for bringing us all together. Thank you, and for holding it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, bye now.